First of all, thank you all for joining. And thank you, Paul, for joining us today for your presentation. The presentation today, as many of you saw, the title of it was called Jewish Communities in Far-Flung Places. Now, my first time that I met Paul, I remember sitting with him at the JCC, and he was sharing a lot about his, I don't want to call it history, he's young, but just he's young and he's done so much. And one of the things that he did, which was quite fascinating for me, was that he really traveled around to many far-flung Jewish communities. And he has a lot of knowledge about them and just memories and things that he was sharing with me, and I only got a glimpse of it. So today, Paul is going to share a little bit more about those Jewish communities in far-flung places. I always think this is kind of a story about Paul, which is why the subtitle was Tales of a Wandering Jew. So again, for those of you who don't know Paul, Paul is currently the director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Phoenix. He has been in a number of positions before this, including one of them working for the U.S. State Department's American Music Abroad and Next Level programs, which was in many countries, over a dozen countries around the world, including countries that were in conflict. So I assume that some of his travels and who he has met was because of these specific responsibilities that he had within the State Department, but we will find out together. So thank you, Paul. I'm going to spotlight you and give you the floor.
Well, thank you, Levi. It's an honor to be back with you again. As Levi mentioned, my name is Paul Rockower. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council. This is my second lecture for Smile on Seniors. The first one was about Jewish communal public diplomacy. If you missed that lecture, it is online. And the purpose of that one was talking about the work we do for the JCRC here. And one of the things I talked about was in communal public diplomacy, we do storytelling. We tell the story of the Jewish community here to help communicate who we are. And to do that, you have to take a step back and understand the Jewish community in general around the world. And I've been very lucky that I've been able to write about a lot of Jewish communities all over the place. I've been to over almost 85 countries. I speak varying degrees of 9 languages, and my travels have taken me all over for work and study. And I've had the opportunity to write about a lot of Jewish communities, of which I'm going to share with you a bit today. So if all of the Jewish journalism comes, naturally, it's because my great-grandfather is the namesake for the Simon Rockower Awards, which is the Pulitzer Prize for Jewish journalism. And so I'm very proud that my family has helped support the Simon Rockower Awards over the years. Outlets like The Forward, JTA, Hadassah Magazine have all been recipients of the Simon Rockower Awards. So I kind of come to this naturally. And really, I could begin this story, this genesis of the story, in a lot of places. Perhaps in Morocco, where I was studying during my junior year abroad, and got to experience for the first time spending a Passover Seder with the Moroccan Jewish community, or at Brandeis, where I was an undergraduate, and I lived this quintessential Brandeis life. I lived my senior year with a Turkish Jew, a Colombian Jew, a Russian Jew in our suite, and we spoke 8-9 languages among us. I ended up studying Islamic and Middle Eastern studies with a focus on Jewish communities in the world of Islam. And so this, is part of the Jewish story. And really, when I first understood the narrowness of our understanding of where Jews are located was when I first moved after my undergraduate work. I moved to Texas. I was the press officer for the Consulate General of Israel to the Southwest. And invariably people ask me, are there Jews in Texas? And, of course, the answer is there are Jews everywhere. And Texas has a wonderful Jewish community, very strong. And you can look at Galveston, which had been a port of entry for Jewish communities. And so that always kind of sparked my curiosity of why our understanding of Jewish communities was somewhat parochial at times. And so that led to me ending up writing a column for the Jerusalem Post called Tales of a Wandering Jew. And I'm going to share with you some of those stories. Hold on, let me get this online. And hold on one second, I need to pull this up for you. Share screen, share that, and share this. And so I'm going to talk to you a bit about Jewish communities all over the world. And as I mentioned, I'm going to begin this, this story of where I really began my work writing about Jewish communities in far-flung places. I was a Rotary visiting fellow in South Africa. And we all know the story of the Jews of South Africa, the fight against the apartheid, the Jewish communists who were involved in that. We know of these strong Jewish communities in Cape Town and in Joburg. But what I got to write about first was the Jewish community of the hinterlands of South Africa, in places like Bloemfontein, in the middle of South Africa, where Jewish merchants, the itinerant merchants, the smous, were the lifeblood of these communities. And so you find all sorts of interesting anecdotes and the stories of Jewish communities in places you don't always expect. The first column I wrote for the Jerusalem Post was about the Jewish communities of the hinterlands of South Africa and how they had helped build up South Africa and make it such a thriving place, and the roles of Jews who fought in the Boer War between the British and the Boer republics. There was a famous scout named Jackie Fisher who was the lead scout, basically a spy for the General Jan Smuts, who led the Boer armies, and he ended up saving the Boer armies because the British were coming to ambush them. He saw them in the distance and swam across the Vaal River and managed to alert the Boer armies and help save them. I see a cat on the screen. That's great. And so that got me interested in the stories of the Jewish communities all over the place. Specifically in Bloemfontein, there had been a very large Jewish community, and over time the Jewish community left. It moved to Cape Town, it moved to Joburg, moved to Israel, moved to all sorts of places. And so over years, the Jewish cemetery of the town, as the townships encroached upon it, became overrun with houses, with livestock, grazing through the cemetery, which of course desecrates it. And so what the Jewish community of South Africa did, is they helped move the cemetery to Israel. They reinterred all of the cemetery in Israel. They brought the descendants of the families to Israel to help reinter their loved ones and have a very moving ceremony. And so that really sparked my interest in Jewish communities. And then there's another side part of this, which I'm going to share with you, and I hope I'm not being too cheeky on this one, but as I learned in the middle of South Africa, they have a belief about the Jews in that if you shag a Jew, if you have biblical relations with a Jew, you receive 7 years good luck. And I found this out in a bar when these two older women found out I was Jewish and started pinching me and said, "Come here, boy, give me your luck." I said, please, I'm not a piece of kosher meat. And so that's one of the fun things that you learn, is how others interpret the Jews, how they appreciate the Jews. And I can share a little bit about that because I've written about being Jewish in Pakistan. I've written about being Jewish in Kurdistan and Iraq. But I've been very lucky and been able to share the history and the stories of our communities. And really, we have millions of stories, like in southern India, where Jews came with in the age of Solomon and Sheba. I'll talk a little bit about the communities in Cochin, or converso communities in Tijuana, whose families came to the New World to escape the fires of the Inquisition. I'll talk a little bit about Tijuana's Jewish community, where Jewish life was kept secret, but the Jewish traditions were saved. And I'll talk a little bit about the Jews of Jamaica, which came with Columbus's second ship. I wrote about that one for the Jerusalem Post as well. But really, there's been three types of communities I've encountered in the tales that I've written. The first one is Jewish communities on the rise. And you see this in places like China, in Beijing, where you have one of the fastest growing Jewish communities in the world. In the upper left, my upper left corner, is a picture of a pagoda mikveh, which the Chabad there had created. And I wrote a story about the Chabad there as they were planning for the Olympics, the Beijing Olympics, and making sure that there was access to kosher food, and really creating the institutions in China, which has just a tremendously fast growing Jewish community. And Chinese history, which dates back, almost as long as Jewish history, if not longer, there's been literally no instances of anti-Semitism. The Chinese are very much philo-Semites. They respect the Jews. I even had one rabbi in China say that all of the Jews should move to China because 14 million people is nothing. We have that in parts of Shanghai. So as you see there, there's a picture of the Chinese mikveh pagoda and a rabbi who's helping kosherize food. The other thing that's very interesting about the Chinese community in China is the story of Shanghai. Some of you may or may not know, but Shanghai was one of the last ports of refuge, and where lots of Jews came fleeing the Holocaust. They arrived to Shanghai because it was one of the last places you could find refuge. And there was already a Jewish community in Shanghai. The Cessne family had helped build the Shanghai and helped create its meteoric rise through its, at one point, Victor Cessne owned 90% of the buildings in Shanghai. Victor Cessne of the Cessne family had a great quote. He said, "There's only one race greater than the Jews, that's the Derby." But anyway, Shanghai has a neighborhood called the Hongkou district, which was called Little Vienna. It looks like little tenement houses. And that became part of the benign ghetto for Jews who were fleeing the Holocaust, who found refuge in Shanghai with the other Chinese during the Japanese occupation. And so Shanghai was a city of refuge, and there's actually a movie about that. I can post the link later and share it. But one of the things up to today, when we were helping in the JCRC world to help stand up to bigotry against the Chinese community now, we bonded with the local Phoenix Chinese community over our shared history of Shanghai. So these things are still relevant now. The last picture I have on there, a picture of a gentleman carrying sufganiyot for Hanukkah. That's in Saigon. I was there in 2007. They were poised to celebrate their first bar mitzvah since the French colonial period. I got to celebrate sufganiyot in Saigon and see the institutions of the Jewish community that are growing leaps and bounds. And I will give a lot of credit to Chabad. I'll talk about that through my tales. I very much respect the way that Chabad creates Jewish institutions around the world. I'm not a Chabad emissary, but I have seen enough of it that I can speak very lovingly and movingly about their work. So if we're talking about Jewish communities on the rise, we also have to talk about Jewish communities in the twilight of their days. There's many, many Jewish communities around the world where they were once, pillars of the Jewish world, and yet over time have diminished. The pictures you see in the bottom right corner is pictures from Cochin, a place called Jewtown. That's an actual place in Cochin. It's one of the oldest Jewish communities in India. As I mentioned, dates back to Solomon and Sheba. When I was last there was about maybe a dozen Jews left, and they were working on preserving the synagogue, beautiful synagogue that, is filled with paradesi and azulejo tiles. And really, how do you preserve the institutions and these, monuments of Jewish history in places where there is not a Jewish community remaining? And so that's been part of the tales I told as well of how do you preserve these. The picture in the top left corner, my left, is of Alexandria. The Jewish community of Alexandria was so strong that once this was, before the state of Israel, before all of the issues between Israel and the Arab world, but in the early 20th century, a Jewish community leader in Alexandria went so far as to write a letter to the World Jewish Congress urging them to cease calls for a Jewish state, rather advocated that Egypt be considered a place of refuge for Eastern European Jewry. I mean, you can't really imagine that today, but you see this beautiful synagogue that's been preserved, and actually really been preserved in part between a cooperation between the synagogue and the Egyptian state. And so that's the other part of the story of what do you do with these communities when they, when the population of Jewry is no longer there. And I'm glad to answer some questions about that at the end. But then there's everything else in between, which is, the most interesting part of our stories, because this is encapsulating so much of who we are and where we find this. So in Fair Tijuana, where we lay our scene in the bottom left corner, that is a picture of the Jewish community, some members of the Jewish community of Tijuana. The Jewish community in Tijuana is fascinating. It has a traditional kind of Orthodox Latino Jewish community, Jews from Mexico, Jews from Uruguay, who've come to Tijuana for the business side of things, Jews from, Costa Rica, what have you. And there's a community center there, which had statues of the two lawgivers, Moses and Benito Juarez, who was a lawgiver for Mexican society. And then the other side of that community, which is really quite interesting, is those I mentioned who had come back to the fold. There's believed to be as much as 40 million people of Jewish blood in northern Mexico. Northern Mexico was kind of this outpost of life where people fled the Inquisition, and you find all sorts of stories of people whose grandmother would cook pork but would feed it to the dogs, wouldn't serve it to the family, or the mother would light Shabbat candles, and when the children would ask about that, she'd hush them and say, "Don't worry about that, don't ask." And so there are communities of those who have returned to the fold, who have rediscovered their Jewish roots, who have returned and connected to that and really started trying to rebuild their Jewish life based on their heritage. And so that's one of the interesting stories that you will come upon. The picture in the top left is Bombay, which is now known as Mumbai. And Bombay is one of the hearts of the commercial network that span the Cessne family. When the sun never set on the British Empire, the city of Bombay grew like a light in the east, and in part because of the Cessne family. And Bombay looks today what London looks like before the Blitz. So the Jewish community of Bombay had been took such a strong part in the creation of the city itself. And then you have on the bottom there a picture of a Jewish fellow in Buenos Aires. I lived there and did some stories about the Jewish community in Patagonia, which is, we know about the Jewish community in Buenos Aires, one of the largest in the world, but there are Jewish outposts down in Patagonia, which is in the very bottom of Argentina, in Bariloche, affectionately nicknamed Israel Loche for all of the itinerant Israeli backpackers. There's a Chabad there. I got to spend a Shabbat weekend and learned about some of the institutions that exist in Patagonia to help Jewish communities, Jews find their community when they're backpacking and being itinerant around. And so one of the fun things that I found when I was in Argentina as I was backpacking around, as I was crossing the Straits of Magellan, a bus driver, definitely not Israeli, put on a CD on the bus, and it was Ehud Banai. And I went up to him and I asked him, I speak Spanish, I said, "Where did you get a CD of Ehud Banai?" And he said, "Well, there are so many Israelis that one of them asked me to put it on one day, and I liked it so much that he gave it to me as a gift. And so now I put it on my bus all the time." And so that's one of the interesting things of being a wandering Jew is you find lots of other wandering Jews, which are the itinerant Israelis who are in India, who are in South America, who are in Thailand, Southeast Asia. And what you see is the institutions and the networks that Chabad creates in Laos, in Thailand, in Bangkok, where you can get shakshuka in Bangkok. And there's all sorts of rich life there. So that's a little bit of the everything in between. And as I mentioned, the outpost of Jewish life, the picture of the Beit Chabad that's in Luang Prabang. Behind you see is a mikveh made out of bamboo. The other picture is in, I think that was in India. It's been a while, but that was, just an indication of how much Chabad serves as emissaries and ambassadors for Jewish life in all sorts of places. And so one of the things I mentioned, let's see, the Forgotten and Unknown Tales. I talked a little bit about the Jewish community of Jamaica and how it dated back to Columbus's second ship. So the Jewish community of Jamaica is fascinating. There is a synagogue in the middle of Kingston with white sand floors. And I was there during a Hurricane Dean. I had to swim my way through the flooded, fetid streets of Kingston, literally carrying my camera over my head to get myself to Shabbat because I was not going to miss Shabbat at this beautiful white sand floored synagogue. And the reason why it has white sand floors is two reasons. One, because of the island heritage of Jamaica, but two, because this was a community that fled the Inquisition. And so before they fled the Inquisition, they would put sand on the floors of their basements to muffle the sounds of their prayers. And so this is a way of reminding that heritage of those who fled the Inquisition. And so that's an important part of the Jewish communities, remembering those communities that have fled, that had to do that. And the picture on the left, that is also Tijuana. I mentioned about that one. But it's important for us to remember these forgotten tales, these unknown tales, to learn about these. I have a colleague named Donnie Rothstein who has been building the Jewish life in Mallorca, which is a community of, that had to hide, called Chuetas. I'll have to see about bringing him on here one of these days. But our history is so rich and so profound, and it's so important to tell this. And so I'm going to move on to this last slide, which is the one that I started with, because as I mentioned, being a Jew in far-flung places, you run into all sorts of fascinating people. This slide was designed by a Muslim Indian calligrapher who does Hebrew and Arabic calligraphy. I met him. I did a story about him for the Huffington Post. He lived in Cochin when I met him, and he taught himself Hebrew. He's a Muslim who was interested in calligraphy, taught himself the Hebrew letters based on a Gideon Bible, which had the 26 different prayers written in the back. And he taught himself the Hebrew alphabet and started making Hebrew calligraphy. And what he did is he took Kufic Arabic script and made Hebrew calligraphy out of it. He made Birkat Habayits and all sorts of things because he became he was so fascinated with the Jewish community and Jewish life, and he really became a central figure in the Jewish community in Cochin, was very close friends with a woman named Sarah Cohen, one of the last matriarchs of the Jewish community. I got to meet him. He designed this slide for me as a thank you for the story and to remind us that, we have people who are so interested in our story who are not Jewish. As I mentioned, I wrote a story about being a Jew in Pakistan. I had all sorts of interesting adventures in Pakistan where people were curious. They wanted to see my star. They wanted to know about, the curls. Why do Jews wear curls? In Iraq, I had similar circumstances where, people wanted to know if the Jews read the Quran. Do they believe in Jesus like the Christians? But often people are just very curious of, who are the Jewish communities, especially in Kurdistan. They knew they had a Jewish legacy and Jewish history of Jewish communities, and there was really a lot of longing and missing the Jews that had lived there. They were very proud of the Jews who lived in Kurdistan, and you find that in a lot of places of curiosity where you wouldn't expect it, welcoming where you wouldn't expect it, and a lot of questions about what it means and what it means to be Jewish. So that is a little bit about the Jewish communities in far-flung places. I am happy to share more and answer your questions. I will stop sharing and see if you have any questions.
So first of all, thank you for that. I call that almost like an intro. Obviously, to go through every city or town or village that you've traveled through would really probably take multiple presentations. But I figured for everyone on here, if you do have questions about specific towns, I have a couple questions, and we'll make sure that everyone has an opportunity to ask. For example, I spent a year in Argentina, so I know all about the Bariloche and the backpackers. Just to give you a reference for that Passover program in Bariloche, they service 2,000 Israeli backpackers, 1,000 in the Zhao Zhao hotel and 1,000 in the city because not everyone can fit there. So that's why I went. We did a Seder for Israelis. But also, just another point that you mentioned, Jamaica. We're actually having a presenter, a professor from ASU, Stanley Mervis, who has written and wrote a book, I think, specifically about Judaism and Jewish history in Jamaica. So he's going to be on, I think it's next week or the following week.
I hope I don't preempt his story, but I got a quick story.
Share the story. You have the floor today.
There was a famous pirate named Moshe Enriquez, a bloodthirsty pirate who was known to be merciless, except on the Shabbat. He would never execute anyone. He would never make them walk the plank on the Sabbath. So that is one of the stories that I incorporated, and maybe Professor Mervis can share more of that one. And also in Jamaica, there were so many Jews in the Parliament of Jamaica that during the high holidays they would cancel the Parliament because they wouldn't have a quorum to run the Parliament in Jamaica.
That's really interesting. Yeah, he's going to be on December 9th. I just checked. So this coming Wednesday. And yeah, so that'll be really interesting. But I am going to open up the floor. I see that a number of people have questions, but before anyone asks a question, of all the cities and far-flung places that you have actually visited, which one would you say was most unique for you?
Oof, that's a hard one. So I don't know if I mentioned this last time, but one of the more profound for me, the reason I'm here in Phoenix, Arizona, was because I was in a city called Chefchaouen in Morocco. This beautiful city of blue in the Reef Mountains. And the reason why it's blue is because it was Jews who fled the Inquisition who ended up in North Africa, and they painted their houses blue in Chefchaouen. And there were so many that they eventually painted the whole city blue. And the city is it's this wonderful, intricate city, and there's all these hues and pastels of blue. And I was there on a little sabbatical to try and figure out which way the world was turning after some work. And it was there that Charlottesville hit. And there were Nazis marching through the streets in Charlottesville, which is really what brought me back here to work for the JCRC and help defend the Jewish community, was this realization that if we don't fight for this, I could be in another Chef Challen someday. And so that's really what brought me here. So that's been one of the more poignant of reminding me of our heritage and history and the need to fight to protect what works for the American Jewish community.
Wow, thank you. Lauren, you had a question?
Well, I don't know if I had a question as much as a comment, but when you talk about Shanghai, and you're probably aware of this, because when we were there, we were told that the reason the reason the Chinese did not let, I guess I'm saying it wrong, when the Japanese took over the area, the Nazis wanted, they wanted the Jews because they wanted to obviously execute the Jews. And the Japanese would not let them do it. And the reason I understand is because during the Russian-Japanese War, there was an Australian industrialist who loaned money to the Japanese for the war. Because of that, the Japanese remembered that and they protected the Jews during World War II.
I hadn't heard that story, but I can't say, the Japanese didn't, I don't know if they quite protected the Jews, but they weren't anti-Semitic. They didn't care the same way that the Nazis cared. They, in fact,
right. They would not allow to turn, they would not turn the Jews over to the Nazis.
Exactly. And there were stories of Japanese diplomats who were like Schindler. There's actually a very interesting story called the Fugu Plan about when Imperial Japan was making plans to control the world, they found out about the protocols of the Elders of Zion. That was their first introduction to the Jews, and they found out that the Jews controlled the world, and they wanted to control the world, so therefore they needed to get some Jews. So they made a plan called the Fugu Plan. Fugu is a pufferfish, and I'll explain why it's called this. They had a plan which they never quite implemented. They were going to get some Jews, a small colony of Jews, that they could study their ways and figure out how the Jews did what they did. Now, it's called the Fugu Plan, the pufferfish, because the pufferfish is very toxic and very poisonous if you eat it the wrong way. And they were terrified that if they got too many Jews, the Jews would take over Japan and they would be poisoned by the Jews. So that was kind of their first connection to it. It's called the Fugu Plan. It was never implemented, but the Japanese were not especially anti-Semitic. They didn't care, and they couldn't figure out why the Nazis didn't like the Jews so much, but they were more interested in other things. So they didn't play along. There are some stories, and that could be the case. I hadn't heard that story, but I can't say, that very much might be the case. Other people have longer historical memories than we Americans, not we Jews. We Jews have very long historical memories, but that might indeed. I see some other hands. So
yes, Stan, you had a question.
Two things. When we were on our honeymoon back in '73, we were on a bus and I had collected passports. And there were 2 Japanese passports on the bus and no Asians. And it was a Jewish couple in the back of the bus. They fled during the Second World War. They fled to Japan and survived the Second World War in Japan. The Japanese never bothered them for being Jewish.
Yeah.
The question I had was, you had the synagogue in Jamaica as over the entrance is a graven image in my mind.
Oh, that was actually Mumbai. That was Bombay. That was Cessne. So that was actually not a synagogue. That was the Cessne Library, and it was a picture of the Cessne family. So yeah, good point. I'm sorry, I should probably clarify. That was actually not that last picture on. That was the Cessne Library, so not a picture, not a graven image on the synagogue. I have one fun story from Iraq. So when I was in Iraq, I had a friend I met there and I wrote a story about this for the Huffington Post called Fiddler on the Roof in Kurdistan. You can still find that online. But this one gentleman named Omar from Mosul, when he found out I was Jewish, he looked at me and said, "Funny, I didn't think you were Jewish. I thought all you Jews were named Stein."
Yeah.
So other questions? Sorry, please.
No, this is great. Anyone have any questions or a city that you wanted to know if Paul has ever visited? That is always a great. Judy, you wanted to ask something.
Well, I think people that are born in the faraway places, or they just decided to leave? what I would call normal places and go to Tijuana and
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? It kind of broke up a little bit.
oh, I'm sorry. Were these people born in faraway places?
Good
Or
question.
did they leave, let's say, Minneapolis to go to Tijuana?
Very good question. So some of these stories were about those who had moved for business. You know, in China, they were not Chinese Jews. They were Jews who came to China and were making a life there. In some, you know, some circumstances, it were Jews who lived there. And like in Tijuana, those were Jews, you know, who had been there possibly hundreds of years and were rediscovering their roots. Some who had moved from around Mexico, you know, were Jewish, Mexican Jews who moved there. In places like Vietnam, these were Jews who had moved, you know, for business, Australian Jews, Canadian Jews, American Jews, British Jews, Israelis who came there for business and were, and you know, the trappings of Jewish life were being built in part thanks to Chabad. I give Chabad tremendous credit for helping create institutions in places that were just starting to build. In other places like India, you know, these were Jewish communities. These were Indian Jews who looked Indian, but were Jews who date back for, you know, thousands of years. So it really depends on the community. Some of them, you know, in South Africa were Jews who had been there for hundreds of years, 100 plus years. So it really depends on the community. But, you know, in some places it was people who had come for business and were starting to make a life there. In others, it were people who had been there for a long time. I think I saw a chat question. I have not been to Durban, unfortunately. I haven't made it to Durban. I spent some time in the Eastern Cape and the Free State and Lesotho. Spent some time in Cape Town and Joburg, but not Durban, unfortunately. So I am remiss in my South African adventures on that one.
It's
Well,
just
have you
on
ever
his
been
bucket
to-
list.
Have you been to Białystok, Poland?
I have not been there. I have been to Poland. I have not been to Białystok. Next on the list, if we can ever start traveling again.
If you've been to Argentina, have you also been in the areas of Ecuador, Peru?
I have been to Peru, but not with the Jewish communities, the kind of the hidden Jewish communities there. I have not done any stories about them. Those stories are well documented and they're fascinating. I am familiar with what you're talking about, but and that's worth looking up. The beauty of Wikipedia, you can find all sorts of stuff, and there's some just fascinating Jewish communities around the world. You know, the Jewish community in Uganda. I've been to Ethiopia. I saw they just brought some more Ethiopian Jews because there's a conflict going on right now in northern Ethiopia, unfortunately, and they were able to bring some more Ethiopian Jews, or even Falasha Mora was probably more likely. Yeah.
Right? 65. Should mention it.
I think that was a mistake on there. Yeah. So
Other questions?
I have a question. What got you into and Charlie, actually ask your question first and I'll go back.
Okay. I spent a week down in the ABC Islands just north of Venezuela. And I don't recall which island it was, but they said the synagogue down there was the oldest in the Caribbean.
Oh, yes, that is St. Martin.
It was ABC, so it had to be Aruba.
Aruba, yeah.
Barbados or
Yeah. Maybe it's Aruba or, yeah.
Aruba, Barbados, or Caracal.
Yeah, it's either Aruba or Barbados. I think.
No.
No, it's Curacao.
Curacao, yeah. Oh, Curacao is the oldest one?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was written up in a Hadassah magazine.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there's one there that's one of the oldest in the New World. Recife in northern Brazil has historic hidden Jewish communities. You know, there's all sorts of, and the New World especially is filled with all these hidden stories of Jews who are fleeing the Inquisition and hid their identity. And you see that in a lot of places, but it's really part of our story. And what I'd recommend is, if you get a chance, look at Jewish Majorca. I think it's jewishmajorca.com. My friend and colleague Donnie Rothstein does a phenomenal program sharing about the history of the Jewish community of Majorca, the Chuetas. He's done just tremendous work, and he does virtual tours of Majorca. I'd recommend you look up his site, because the stories he has of the Chuetas are fascinating stuff. And that it's important that we know the hidden stories of our history, because that helps us, understand what our ancestors, our great grandparents went through to maintain their Judaism. And it's important to know these things.
Yeah, well, you were talking about why people were winding up in Mexico. I have relatives who were in Mexico City because they were down there waiting for their papers so they could come to the U.S. I had others who were in Matamoros, right across from Brownsville.
Yeah.
They lived in Mexico, but they had a business in Brownsville.
Yeah.
They couldn't get their papers, so their business was in Brownsville.
Yep.
Then my father, he was a sheikh. He went all around the little towns outside of Houston. He made a circuit every month. He went around and took care of all the little towns.
A very common story, especially here in the Southwest, of the Jewish itinerant merchants. As I mentioned, in South Africa, they were called the Smouse. And I saw in a city of Graaff-Reinet, they had a plaque, honoring the Jewish merchants, because they were truly the lifeblood of these small towns in the Karoo Desert, in the middle of South Africa. They were the ones who brought all the goods and wares, and they were the ones who were the lifeblood. And you see that story of the itinerant Jewish, merchants, peddlers, all over the world. It's truly our story, and it's important to honor that story.
You have a question in the chat. With the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany, what are the Jewish communities in Germany doing?
That's a very good question. Germany has had one of the fastest growing Jewish communities in the world. There have been some issues with rising anti-Semitism. My understanding is that the German government is doing more to help protect the Jewish communities these days. We know the story of Halle, Germany last year, and thankfully, because of the investments made in security by the World Jewish Congress, one of the major Jewish organizations had invested in the security of the synagogue, and they had a door that blocked that perpetrator from being able to break in and cause more damage. There is an increase in German connection to security for Jewish communities. We hosted a program last year with a former German diplomat who talked about the situation of Jews in Germany today. I can tell you that it's something very important to the German state, and they are aware of the issues. And it will continue to be an issue. The Jews in Germany are not the only ones who are threatened, but they are being threatened in some ways on the security, and it is an issue. But I think there's more of an understanding now that this issue has to be something that's tackled. It's more in the eastern parts of Germany. There was a tremendous amount of Holocaust education in West Germany. East Germany didn't have it, and so there's still a lot of xenophobia in Eastern Germany, a lot of rise in the right wing there. With that said, it's been kind of slightly trending downward. There's a group called AfD, which is an extremist, far-right party in Germany. And they had started to do well in the polls, but they look like they're kind of dropping now. It's complicated, is the short of it. But if you're interested in German Jewish life, there's the Leo Baeck Institute from the American Jewish Committee, and we've done programs. We did a program last year with a German diplomat who, grew up on a kibbutz. He was a German diplomat, spent time in Israel on a kibbutz, spoke very powerfully about, Germany learning from the past. And I think there's at least a fair amount of understanding of that in Germany. And more so than other places. I mean, Germany dealt with his past in ways that Austria didn't, in ways that France didn't, and didn't discuss it. In fact, it was Francois Mitterrand who was the first to talk about how, it wasn't just the occupation, the Vichy occupation authorities. It was real French people who were collaborators with the Nazi regime in France. And so that's still part of the discussion of who was, who took part in this. And it's just important to remember these things. I mean, it's on, my generation and the generation after to make sure that this is still something that we make sure is taught and people understand and identify the issues that took place. But actually, there was just a recent article in the Arizona Republic, which I think is quite interesting, about how in Yavapai County, the county attorney Sheila Polk uses Holocaust education to help sensitize her the police force about what it means to always understand what is right.
Paul, if you want to learn more about that, we actually took two of her, I guess, presenters for that, and they shared that presentation with us. So you can actually watch a condensed version.
Oh, fantastic.
And a couple of people that were on here earlier, I mean, Stan Martin, Lauren Greenberg, who's on here, and Francine Garner. It was done through a partnership and really sponsorship from the Jewish Community Foundation there. So they're all very knowledgeable in that.
I'm telling you, you know this more than I do.
Actually, Paul, I've got a couple copies of the abbreviated program. If you want a copy, I can give it to you.
That would be terrific.
Well, he can watch our video.
Yeah.
Oh, you're right. You can watch the video.
Yeah. We hosted a program with the Bureau of Jewish Education and with the Phoenix Holocaust Association last year with Sheila Polk and Professor Alex Alvarez of NAU, and they talked about Holocaust education, and we've been working on the Holocaust, the teaching Holocaust and other genocides bill. We've been doing some work on that with the partners who are involved in that. What
has happened with that bill at the state of Arizona?
So it was going forward smashingly well, and then the legislature had to adjourn because of COVID last year. It has to be resubmitted this year. We're optimistic, it will probably be resubmitted and will, move forward the way that it was last year. There were some dynamics that existed in the last legislature that I don't think will cause the same issue this time. And so I'm optimistic that will come through this legislative season. I think that would be a very good and positive thing. It's important. I see a hand up question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that we were in Prague and in Budapest in 2014. Before you went into a synagogue, you were patted down.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to mention, that my wife was living in Spain in '65, and that's the first year that they allowed Jewish services in Spain in the open. I'm not talking about hidden. In the open, you could actually go to services, and it was acceptable.
Yeah, what happened was they had it at the Hilton Hotel. So I, wanted to go to Rosh Hashanah service, and they showed me this ballroom where all the men were praying, and the women were in the next ballroom, and the ballroom had mirrored columns. So all the women were prepping. And I walked in and I said, "Where are the prayer books?" And they said, "Why?" And I said, "Well, why are you here?" And they said, "Well, we're waiting for our husbands to finish praying." So I asked a man if he would, sneak me a book. And I prayed, right? But there was no one with me. It was very surreal.
I'm going to, while we're here, I'm going to put a couple of things in the chat that I had mentioned that you can check out yourselves. This is a website for Jewish Mallorca. I would recommend doing one of those tours. The next thing I'm going to post, which is a little funnier, is a hysterical video of Jewish moms trying other Jewish moms' brisket. Somebody mentioned brisket earlier. if you get a chance, it's really quite funny to watch the different Jewish moms try other moms' briskets. And then I'm going to
We should do that once. Taste test here.
watch the video before you ever think about doing that. It's not for the faint of heart. I'm going to put a, let's see. Hold on one second. Let me see if I can get this. You have to, I'm putting a blog, the link to my blog where all of the old columns from the Jerusalem Post and other stories are. You can find it there. You just have to search a little bit for the different stories. Because it's been some years since I wrote a number of the stories. So you just have to kind of pick through the site and find them. And then there was one last thing I was going to, Fiddler on the Roof in Kurdistan I mentioned. I'll post that in the chat. I'm giving you all sorts of links to go through. You can take your time on that. And then let's see if I can find, there was one last one. I did a piece this year about Rosh Hashanah in far-flung places. Let me see if I can find that. Anyway, does anybody have any questions while I look for some of these links?
If not, what I can do is I'll officially say thank you and conclude the formal part of the program. And we can, of course, if anyone has any questions, we can continue off the formal part. But Paul, thank you so much. And I know that we all learn from all these different communities as well, sort of how they persevere. And I'm sure you took some of that as well away from your visits. But thank you.